So welcome everyone. As I said, my name is Christian Almenar. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Intrinsic. And I'm here today with Devon Rifkin, so my co-founder and also CTO. And we're very excited to be here with you guys today. We want to share some of our thoughts about the security industry and application security in particular. And talk a little bit about what we think are some of the upcoming risks and things we should tackle as an industry. And hopefully we can have a conversation and also hear from you guys what your thoughts are around application security, and if there's how you're tackling here at PayPal and what kind of challenges you guys are facing. We'd love to hear from you as well. So we have some time for Q&A. And just as we get started, we could get a quick raise of hands. And anybody here work directly or tangentially on security here at PayPal? Okay, that's pretty good. Awesome. So yeah, we just to give a little bit of background on ourselves and our company. Intrinsic, we've been working at Intrinsic for 3 years now, but in reality, we've been working on this space for much longer. I personally was working more on the industry side, and part of our company was also working at the academic setting. We were 4 co-founders. We met at school, and actually 2 of our other co-founders are professors in computer science and security. Our other 2 co-founders are David Macieres, which is a security professor at Stanford, and our other co-founder is Dan Stefans, a security professor at UCSD. And we've been thinking about security, and we're very passionate about it for a long time, and especially looking at it from a systems point of view. Like, how can we build systems and build them in so that you are secure by default, like from a preventive angle, and applying that at a programming language level. And we got really motivated starting this company mostly through our research project that we were all involved in back in school. That was it's like a DARPA-funded project around securing programming languages. And there was a lot of work done in quite esoteric language called Haskell that some of you may have worked with. It's a functional language that it's really cool. It's not mainstream. But there's a lot of work done around that, being able to, how do we harden that language so that it's secure against unknown threats or kind of worst case scenarios, which is when you happen to be running malicious code in your server. So we got really inspired by that work, and we said, how about we start a company around this and apply our knowledge to other more mainstream languages. So at Intrinsic, we've been working really hard and looking into deep how it really some of the mainstream languages work, and we've done a lot of work around JavaScript and its applications on the back end, so especially with node.js, and understanding really how it works and how can we harden the language so that we can build safer applications from the beginning. And node.js, I think, is a great example of how the software development industry has evolved for the last few decades. If you think about it, back in the day, software development was more a thing that was done purely in-house, building from scratch. And it has evolved now to this massive collaborative effort where we're all relying on each other's work and a lot of the third-party dependencies and a lot of frameworks that we all are able to use today thanks to the open source movements and allow us to build amazing products in a much more efficient and timely manner. And if you look at it, it's been mostly kind of making analogies with other industries, for example, the automotive industry also went through a similar transition, right? Where before it was all developed in-house. You pretty much had a factory where you had raw materials in and you had cars out. And now it's this decentralized effort where you have a lot of suppliers bringing in the specialized pieces of the car. They'll get assembled and then we're able to build more safer, more cheaper, and more efficient products. And in software development, there's been similar efforts, but kind of with different incentives. We are reusing a lot of tools that other people have done, but for example, in the automotive industry, there's high requirements of security, for example, when you bring in those pieces in place. In software, it's not that, that incentive is not in place. Normally the incentives for developers is, let me build something that's cool. First of all, let me make sure it works. And then let me try to get some traction. Let me get users. And once I get users and I learn how to improve the product, if I reach a critical mass, then I'll think about security and see how I can retrofit security in place. So Node.js is a great example for that. Where it has a thriving community, a lot of packages, a lot of you can build systems really fast. But In reality, once you like have a whole system working, then you realize like security was an afterthought when you were when you're designing that system. So we've been seeing a lot of attacks now, kind of moving from person or company centric, where there's like a certain company or individual being targeted to like get some of their credentials or some of their sensitive data, to more like attackers getting deeper in the stack and looking more at how to get how to attack the building blocks that we all trust and rely on as an industry. And those are called supply chain attacks, where somebody's able to compromise some of the frameworks or open source systems that we all use, and suddenly they had a much bigger impact, and not just compromising one company, but compromising everyone, because everybody suddenly has is trusting that code that's being pushed through one of those frameworks, and suddenly everybody gets compromised. And I'm going to lead it to my co-founder Devon, who's going to walk you through some slides and give you a little bit of historical background. We like to look at technology as like, we don't need to reinvent the wheel and come up with very fancy systems. We just need to like really look back when people in the 60s and their 70s were like thinking about the future and how the world was going to look like. They already were thinking about the security and the privacy implications of all these new technologies we're going to have. And they already were coming up with solutions around how to protect ourselves against those things. So I think it's interesting to look back, first understand how people were thinking about it, and then see how we can improve the current state. So I'm just going to give it up to Devon.
All right, thanks, Christian. All right, so the talk today is called "The Only Option Left for Securing Modern Software: Stop Trusting Code." So we'll get a little deeper into what we mean by that. So first, let's talk about modern software development. And we probably all know it's pretty awesome. There's a lot of things that have all been coming together in recent years that make us a lot more productive and makes it a lot more enjoyable to work on things, and we can get a lot of feedback. So some of this is like even just GitHub changed the way that open source works together. The DevOps movement as a whole led to developers feeling more empowered and less of a separation organizationally. So I want to look at 3 different like big key defining things of modern development. The first one I want to look at is package management. So package management has gotten really, really good. And one of the big players here is a company called NPM. And so this is the package manager for Node. And they started it with this crazy idea, which was, what if the package manager would never fail due to not being able to resolve dependency conflicts? And that seemed kind of crazy back then. But basically they're like, okay, just make copies of multiple versions of the same package and just let people use the version they want to use. Now, from this chart right here, you can see that it's been wildly successful. That's 5 billion packages downloaded in the past week, and NPM's like the biggest repository by a factor of at least 2. So it's been pretty crazy good. Another big shift has been CI/CD. There have been a lot of companies making it so that continuous integration and continuous delivery means that we can get faster feedback on the software we're writing, but also from our customers by delivering faster. So back in the day, we used to have really long development cycles, and we'd ship software to stores in cardboard boxes. But now we ship multiple times a day to our websites and services and mobile apps and so on. So things are changing a lot there, and we can get a lot better feedback cycles. And then the way that we deploy things has changed dramatically. And this started happening with the advent of VMs and the cloud. And at the beginning, we kind of had metaphors that were just, okay, let's have a virtual server that really behaves like the server we're used to. But more recently, we're starting to have container-based things with Docker and arranging these containers with Kubernetes. And even beyond that, we're starting to see these serverless options, like starting with AWS Lambda, where you just push your code and they handle everything else. And Google Cloud and Azure is also offering these kinds of things. So all this stuff is really cool, and it lets us build stuff fast with a lot of feedback and more easily. I want to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the packaging stuff. So Node.js is a really interesting project. It kind of grew organically, but it's really taken over a lot of the industry. Starting with kind of NPM, with the way that it works, where there aren't conflicts, it led to an experiment where people started making really, really small packages. to the point where sometimes it would be like each function was a package. And so this was a really cool experiment where there was just a huge thriving ecosystem. And people were able to build really cool stuff and experiment a lot and find patterns naturally instead of just following what's idiomatic. What's idiomatic in JavaScript changes all the time, which people make fun of, but it's also led to a lot of innovation there. So one of the consequences of this is the standard library for Node is really, really small. JavaScript is pretty small too. It's pretty lightweight, but it has some built-in stuff for like web servers, but even the basics that you'd kind of expect from another standard library aren't there. So people tend to install these packages from the ecosystem. So an example of this is Express right here, which we're looking at. So Express, you kind of use it when you're starting your web server project. It just helps you serve some web stuff. And so what this tree is showing is this is showing which dependencies Express itself has. And so there are 42 nodes on this tree right now. And this is just one dependency among many. So for a typical web app, what does this look like? So it probably looks something like this. And in fact, this is just a starter kit. So we went on GitHub and we searched for node starter and we sorted by stars. And so this one has 23,000 stars. And there's a lot going on here. But this is just the starter kit. So this is about over 700 dependencies. And this is very, very typical in a Node app. This is not unusual. It is quite common to have thousands of dependencies in a normal app. Like this is a package with 23,000 stars on GitHub. And in a lot of ways, this really shows the magic of NPM. Like, you're able to have all this complexity and not even realize it's going on. And so that's actually really cool. Like, you get to make use of all these packages and things kind of just work. They also have, one of NPM's other benefits is their use of semantic versioning. So you typically get automatic updates to packages without getting things broken. So getting bug fixes and security updates happens a lot more. And this is all stuff that kind of happens automatically without you knowing. Now, instead of just looking at the dependencies, let's start looking at some of the community and who's building this stuff. So right here, we have, these are the avatars on GitHub of people who've authored commits. And so there's 221 of them. But these aren't for all those dependencies we saw in the tree. This is just for Express. And this isn't even Express's dependencies. This is just regular Express. These are all the people that have authored commits to Express. But if we zoom out again like we did before, and we look at every dependency in that tree, all 700, we see something pretty incredible. So that's 13,000 people, or over 13. It's almost 14,000 people. And I think this slide really shows what's so special about modern development. Like, we've built a system where there are thousands and thousands of people working together. You kind of don't even realize it while you're using it, and things generally just work. And so this is pretty amazing. It's also kind of fun to look at, like, do you know people from this? So I looked for a few of our engineers, and I found Brian, and I found Tom. So that was pretty fun. But anyway, like we said before, modern software development is really awesome. There are all these tools, things are built for you already. You get to use this stuff and focus more on building features. But hiding away, or depending on what your job is, like the security people here, probably it's hiding a little bit less from them. There's a lot of complexity here. And so a lot of what we have to deal with, especially in security, is like, how do we manage all of this complexity? And so in particular, the question to a security-minded team is, okay, in the face of this complexity, how can we possibly make our software secure? And this is not a question unique to us, right? This is a question that's happening throughout the industry. There are breaches all the time, and there's more sensitive data flowing everywhere. So this is really important. And a lot of people have been asking this question, and they've been getting some answers that aren't so great. So like we said, the complexity is hidden from you. But people notice that there is a hidden cost to this complexity. So this is Alex Stamos, who has a tweet where he says, the web of interconnected package management that underlies modern web dev is going to cause a disaster soon. And he was responding to a particular event, right? And incidentally, he's been in the news quite a bit as Facebook's CSO. And so the event he was talking about is LeftPad. You may have heard of this. Basically what happened, this happened about 2 years ago, and there was a trademark dispute where somebody got their NPM package taken down, and so in response, they protested and took down all of their packages. And they had, I think, 130 or maybe even more. And this ended up breaking a lot of the internet, particularly from this one function. I mean, this one package, which is really just one function. It's to pad a string to the left. So something that should really be part of the standard library, which actually in the time since then, it has made its way to JavaScript standard library. This package went down, and it wasn't that like a bunch of companies depended on LeftPad directly. Instead, they depended on a dependency that depended on a dependency that depended on LeftPad, right? So this web of transitive dependencies gets pretty crazy. And so when this stuff was unpublished, people started realizing, oh, this complexity that was hidden from us, like there are consequences to this. And in fact, when the package was taken down, anybody could have published any package there, malicious or otherwise. Luckily, a good actor published the same version that was removed, but in the end, the security of a lot of companies was at risk there. NPM responded really well to this, and they instituted new policies that made it so that this can't happen again due to some policies around unpublishing. There recently was an incident where a very similar thing happened due to some spam detection that went wrong, where they took down a package and somebody was able to upload another package that people depended on that didn't match the original contents. So it's kind of scary from a security perspective. But perhaps worse, this is a second tweet and a second problem. So a single person was able to compromise 52% or get the ability to compromise 52% of packages. So one of the consequences on relying on so many people's code is that if any of the people are successfully attacked, so are you. So you're not just relying on your own team's security, right? Like you train your team to be secure, you have best practices, but we saw 13,000 people and 700 dependencies, right? If any of them are successfully attacked, you're in trouble. So this 52% attack that we're talking about, it happened in June of last year. And so it was actually a security researcher. So this is good for us in that people weren't breached for real. And so it was a security researcher in Russia, and he was able to compromise just an insane number of packages. What kind of clued him into this was he noticed people were checking in their NPM passwords on GitHub, like in their .file repos and stuff. And he got the idea of like, okay, so people aren't taking this too seriously, or at least a big percentage aren't. What can I do with this? So what he did was he grabbed a bunch of password dumps from other breaches, and he brute forced a bunch of passwords over a day and a half, and he did some password fuzzing. And in the end, he was able to compromise publish access to 13% of the dependencies. And that's huge. But what's even bigger is that because dependencies depend on other dependencies, transitively, he was able to take control, theoretically, of 52% of the packages. And so again, luckily, he was just a researcher. He notified NPM, and they reset a bunch of passwords, and they also introduced two-factor recently. But unfortunately, attacks like these aren't theoretical anymore. So here's an actual example. So this is a package that I looked last night, and it had been downloaded 150,000 times this past week. So it's being used. And it was attacked by a malicious user taking over compromised NPM credentials. So they were able to log into a maintainer's account and push a bad malicious package. And what this package did was it downloaded a binary and ran it on the computers of people using this package. So this is kind of the worst case scenario, right? Like they're running binaries on your computer because they attacked it. And it was up for almost a day and a half. So this is a real problem. And because of the automatic updating feature, it's not just people who installed that package in a day and a half. It's anybody who did any NPM install of their stuff where it would upgrade automatically. So now we can go back. We've seen a bunch of examples of how this complexity causes problems, but we want to have solutions. So let's go to our question again. How do we make software secure given how complex the setup is? And we've concluded you need to do something very extreme, and that's you got to stop trusting all this code. There's too much code, there's too much going on, it changes every day. You have to have a different model where you don't trust the code anymore. But this is a really easy thing to say, but it's not so easy to do. So how can we actually do this? And so let's take a step back to the 1970s, where it was a really good time for security research, and they had a bunch of ideas. I'm going to show two different papers that have been pretty influential to us, and we can see what we can learn from them. So this first one is, it kind of came about in the early 70s. The Department of Defense was spending a lot of money on how do you secure time-sharing systems that have different levels of security classification on the jobs running in them. And so in this example, this paper is the Bell-LaPadula model, and these were two guys that worked at MITRE, and one of them was a mathematician and the other one was an engineer. And they were tasked with, okay, how do you come up with a mathematical model of what is it, how do you say whether a system is secure or not? And so we won't go too in-depth into the contents of the paper, but this idea of having a very principled approach to security that's rigorous and formal is really inspiring. And they use a feature of computers that's really interesting in that, like, computers are so good at strictly enforcing things. Like, they're great at, like, fuzzy things, not so good, but strictly enforcing things. So if you can model the security problem into a strict enforcement problem, then you've solved a lot of the security problems. Unfortunately, the DoD didn't create new programs to fund this work. And so these very principled approaches haven't really made it into the complete mainstream. They're definitely big in certain industries, so like aerospace and other industries where they need really high assurance software. But what we're trying to do is take these very principled approaches and unleash them on everybody and make it so that it's easy to do this. And so papers like this, where we're exploring very formal models of security, inspired a lot of the work we did at Stanford on building systems that can kind of trace their ancestry back to the papers like this one. And this pattern of technology where at the time it doesn't make it big, but then it comes back decades later, like we see this time and time again. So an example of this is neural networks have been around for decades, but it's only recently that they've really exploded. And that's due to a bunch of data that's everywhere. We've got so much data compared to before, and GPUs are super fast. So the timing worked out now where neural networks came back, and now they're just taking over everything. And in the security domain, a very similar thing happened with virtual machine monitors. So around the same time that this paper came out, like, people were working on using virtual machines as security mechanisms. But it kind of died in a similar way in the 70s until it came back in the late 90s and early 2000s as part of VMware. And that changed how we deploy, like, everything, right? Like, VMs in the early 2000s were huge, and that changed how, that gave us a lot of flexibility and security, ways to architect different secure systems. And so here's the second paper I want to talk about, and this one, it's less about the whole paper, and it's more that this paper was the first to record a really important idea that if I know we have a few security people in the room, but everybody else has probably heard security people talk all the time about least privilege. We're always going on about that. And so this paper is the first to record that. So let's look at what it actually said. So it says, the principle of least privilege is every program and every privileged user of the system should operate using the least amount of privilege necessary to complete the job. And it goes on to explain why this is beneficial. And it's sort of common sense. Like, why give somebody the ability to do something if they don't need it? It can only cause problems. And so what I want to point out is everybody already knows the principle of least privilege. We use this all the time in daily life, and we don't even think about it. Like, it's just kind of common sense. To show that, like, let's look at a real-world example. So this is an apartment building, or at least one from SimCity. So let's go for a classic security trope and talk about locks. We're always talking about locks. So in this apartment building, there might be dozens of families that are living in there, and they all definitely need a key for the front door, right? But if everybody had a key to every apartment inside of this building, that would be crazy, right? Like, you should only have a key to your own door. And so that's a natural way of, we apply least privilege. You should only have the privileges that you actually need. And it almost seems silly to talk about it because it seems so obvious in this setting. So what can we learn about this with respect to software? So like, how do we apply it to software? And so to go into that, I want to show an example web app. So in this example, we're going to have a blog, and we've got one HTTP server in the middle, and on the left, we have a bunch of pages. So we've got the home page, the admin page, and a buy ebook page. And so these different pages, they do different things, and they need different access to things. So the home page just shows all our blog posts. It just reads the blog posts. The admin page, the admin can post new blog posts, and they can also change their password. And then on the buy ebook page, well, I guess it's pretty obvious that you can buy an ebook. Now on the right, we've got a bunch of different resources that our web app server can use. So the green ones are things that it has on its own machine. So it can access the file system. It can spawn child processes. And then below that, we have other backend services that the server might contact. So it uses the user service in order to change the admin's password, or the post service to read posts or to write posts, to make new posts, and the payment service to process payments for the buy ebook page. So if we look and draw arrows, we can say, okay, the web app server needs access to all of these things. But it turns out this isn't all that the web server has access to. There's nothing really stopping it from talking to any other server, right? And so this is where we get into a pretty common way to start applying the principle of least privilege to normal apps. We use firewalls, right? So we say, okay, we only want to let our web server talk to the services that it absolutely needs to. We don't want to, why should it be able to talk to another server if it doesn't need to? It might end up exfiltrating information and stealing our users' stuff. There's no reason to open ourselves to that risk. So this is super commonly accepted now. We kind of take it for granted that you're going to have firewalls in your data centers. And so this is good, but it's not completely satisfying. And so let's go back to the real-world housing example to get a little bit more nuanced about least privilege. So one of the things with least privilege is it's kind of binary whether or not you have it given a system, right? So you can say whether a particular user has the least amount of privileges they need given a set of privileges, right? And which privileges are possible. But the construction of the system, whether it's an apartment building or a piece of software, influences what those choices actually are. So going back to the apartment example, we said that everybody should have a key to their front door. But they should only have, each person should only have a key to their own place, right? That kind of assumes that people have their own places, though. Like, imagine a scenario in which the apartment building had no walls inside. So everybody gets through the front door, and they kind of have their area where they live, but there are no walls. So everybody would just, be really careful and try not to bother each other and try to only put their stuff in their area. But it'd be pretty chaotic. We'd consider that crazy in the real life, in the real world, right? This is the setup's not secure at all, right? Like, people could steal your stuff, and it's super not convenient, right? It's horrible. And so going back to software, there are a lot of parallels to situations like this. So we can kind of think of the walls inside the apartment are strictly enforcing that only the person that owns the apartment can go into it. In software, we kind of play it a little bit looser, where we'll do a lot of monitoring. That's really common these days. So instead of building walls, we put up cameras and make sure that people kind of stay in their own area. And if we find out somebody stole something, we can at least know that they did it. But we don't prevent them from doing it. If we moved into an apartment building that just had a bunch of cameras instead of walls, I don't think any of us would be really happy. In this apartment setting, putting up walls between the apartments and having doors with locks is just totally essential. But there's a little bit more to this too. So it turns out that the effectiveness of applying least privilege also depends on the size of the system. So a big system tends to need a lot more privileges, and the privileges might need to be more fine-grained, like we need walls within the apartment and so on. But if each family lived in a house instead of just in this big apartment building that's a free-for-all, the problem becomes really simple. All we do is they just get a key to their front door and that's it. We don't have to worry about internal walls with respect to security. So now we kind of have an intuition that, all right, both the construction and the size of the system matters a lot. So let's take a look at our example app again with this in mind. So now we've got the web server and we're showing the actual code that's running in there. So for each page, we have a controller in the middle that's in charge of serving that page. And there's a lot more going on here. Like, remember, we showed the dependencies before. There's probably thousands of dependencies in this app. There's a lot going on. But if we go back to the controllers, they're all part of the same system, and they all have the same level of privileges. So all of these arrows right here apply to each controller. They can't talk to other servers, but they can talk to all the services, and each one of them can talk to the file system and spawn child processes. And we're in this situation where we're in the apartment building without walls. We're just kind of hoping these controllers don't interfere with each other and that they won't use privileges that they have access to but don't need. And this wouldn't be acceptable in the real world, and it shouldn't be in software too. So let's look at what we could. Let's look at the implications of this, right? We're not just breaking into people's apartments. What's actually happening? So let's say that we have a bug in the home controller. And let's say it's a horrible bug. It's like a remote code execution. So you're running users' code on your server. So they can do anything that controller is allowed to do. And we are glad that we applied the principle of least privilege to the system originally, because an attacker, the first thing they might want to do is just steal the data and send it to their own server. But the firewall stops them. They can't do that. So that's good. But they can still do a ton of damage because our system has so many privileges. And so here, they exploit the bug in the home controller, and they change the password of an admin user. And they're able to escalate their privileges quite a bit. So this is pretty bad, right? So if we take some inspiration from the whole houses versus apartments scenario, maybe we can try splitting things up in order to have smaller pieces that have fewer privileges. And this kind of goes back to the deployment stuff I was talking about earlier, where as an industry, we're moving more towards like microservices and containers and serverless scenarios where we're just having each controller be delivered separately. So let's go ahead and split it up and see what that looks like. So now we split things up, and because we've done that, each of these pages is a different app, and we can give each of them access to only the resources that they need. So now the home server, it can't access the user service because it has no need to. So they're really limited in what they can do, right? And so we're able to give each of them a smaller set of privileges. So now when we apply the principle of least privilege, our system is much more secure. But it turns out this is a ton of work, right? Like, you have to split up your app, and then over time, apps tend to grow, code bases grow, features grow, and then every so often you'll need to split it up again. And over time, like, the privileges for each of these servers is going to grow. And that means that it will be becoming less and less secure. And so we know that having this like very granular permission setup is really good for security, but it's not great for developer productivity. So now let me show you what we're doing over at Intrinsic. So with Intrinsic, we get the best of both worlds. We go back to the model where you just have your normal app, but what we do is we split it up automatically for you. So you don't have to spend the time splitting it up, but you get the benefits of it being split up. So we split it up by route, so by controller, and then you can apply really, really fine-grained policies to each controller. We're within the language runtime, so we can do policies that need to have a lot of context, which is really nice. And this is implemented all as a library for node.js, so deployment is just like any other library. And we're really focusing on making it ridiculously easy to use. And when you have these policies where we split up your app and apply different policies to each part, those parts can't communicate with each other, and even malicious code can't get past that. So in the case where we had the home controller with the bug, they're automatically constrained to the privileges that the home controller should have, even though our app wasn't split up by us. And so here's what the actual code looks like to do this. So you don't change your app at all. It works completely with legacy code. What you do is you specify which routes you want to split things up by, and use simple whitelist policies to say what each of those routes needs to do. So you don't need to go through and try to figure out all the things that shouldn't happen, right? You don't want to plug a bunch of holes. Instead, you want to say, okay, this is what I expect this area of my app to do, and let me enforce that that remains true. And also, because these policies are just code, you check them in with your code, and it becomes version controlled, and the security team can code review it, and they can see how the privileges of the app changes over time. And this gives the security team a lot of insight into what changes are being made, and also gives a really nice way for the development teams and the security teams to communicate in a really efficient and effective way. And so this stuff, it really helps us improve the security of apps in a really easy way. We did all the hard work. This has been 3 years of building out this system so that the interface is this simple. And we can let developers work on features more, and security teams work on actually securing things instead of dealing with a bunch of overhead of dealing with other teams. And so in the end, everybody wins with this kind of approach.
Right. Big round of applause. Thank you both. Appreciate it.